Zorka, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. So glad to be here.
Great. Maybe could you just start by saying a bit about yourself?
Yes, of course, very happy to. So I work at the FACT Coalition. I'm the policy director, and FACT stands for Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency. We are a civil society coalition that's based in the U.S., and we advocate for a more fair and transparent tax and financial system. And also, in addition to tax justice, we work on a related problem of illicit financial flows. So we're trying to stop the flow of dirty money into the United States. We're a very large and broad coalition. We bring together more than 100 different groups united around these shared goals. And they include labor unions, faith groups, domestic progressive economic justice groups, international development and human rights NGOs, anti-corruption groups, environmental and climate NGOs. So it's a very diverse coalition. And to add that we are proud to be members of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice.
Right. Would it be fair to call you like the U.S. Tax Justice Group?
Well, there are a number of other domestic U.S. tax justice groups, so I don't want to say the, but we work closely with other organizations that are also pushing for tax justice in the U.S.
Great. So in Tax Justice Norway, we, of course, work a lot on the ABCs of tax justice, the automatic exchange of information and beneficial ownership information and country-by-country reporting. And I've been following the FACT Coalition for a while, and I know you work on the same thing. Could you just say something about, or the things I've picked up on, at least, is that you've been working on the beneficial ownership registry as well as the petitioning the Securities and Exchange Committee on public country-by-country reporting. Can you just say a few words on those two initiatives? What is sort of the status there in the U.S.?
Sure. Yeah, those are two of our most important priorities that you mentioned. So the beneficial ownership transparency in the U.S. Is really a huge win for us, even though I should say at the outset that it's not perfect in some ways. For one thing, we don't have a public register, but given the many years, that it took to win this law. It's something that we're very proud of, and it took years and years of persistent campaigning, going back to at least 2008. So even before the Panama Papers and all those tax scandals and leaks,
really? And so now there's a register.
Now there's a register, exactly. It's been online for a while now, and the deadline to report for pre-existing companies was January 1st. Unfortunately, there have been some legal challenges to the statute that have been made in various courts on the grounds that Congress supposedly exceeded their powers under the Constitution in passing the law. So that's something that we are, of course, watching very closely and engaging actively to make sure that the law is defended and that it prevails. So just to mention, I know that there have been also legal challenges against beneficial ownership registries in other parts of the world, so we are not exempt from that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that the challenges are very similar across the world, and maybe especially in like Western OECD countries. But yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, for us, there are objections on the grounds of privacy, but the courts have been focusing more on these issues of whether Congress, because in the U.S. we have a federal system of government, whether Congress had the authority to pass the law, or whether it is something that should be up to the states. And of course, our argument is, given the global nature of this problem, that this is very much a subject for the federal government to address. And given the international standards that exist in this area, So those are just some of the arguments to outline that we are seeing, and we are actually expecting a preliminary decision from the Supreme Court. It's already made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. We are expecting as early as next week, just on the grounds of whether or not the law can continue to be enforced. So is the reporting mandatory or voluntary while these litigation proceedings are unfolding? So it's a kind of limited procedural question, but it's an important signal.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, maybe we have to do a follow-up episode on the beneficial ownership registry in the US. Yeah. That would be very interesting.
Mm. Right, and also a few episodes ago, we recorded an episode with Jason Ward about the public country-by-country reporting in Australia, and that's something we're trying to do in Norway as well, where we have 2 parliamentary resolutions from 2016 and 2021 asking for public country-by-country reporting, but we haven't seen the government follow that up yet. And as far as I understand, you're sort of been trying to get the US to do the same thing. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We have been following with great interest the positive developments in Australia, and we have been engaging actively on that and working with groups in Australia to support them. This is, in addition to beneficial ownership, which we discussed a minute ago, our work on public country-by-country reporting is our other kind of top priority area. And we have had some success, actually, that I can report when it comes to improving the financial accounting standards. So although that's falls short of full country-by-country reporting, there are important improvements in the way that companies that are subject to U.S. accounting standards will have to account for their taxes. So they will have to do more detailed breakdowns for different countries, not necessarily all the countries, but more kind of material jurisdictions, and also to do more detailed kind of rate reconciliation to explain the differences in effective tax rates. And so we think that's really significant progress, and we will start to see some of that. The first reports, we will start to see them as early as this year, actually, later this year. But we are still continuing to push for full country-by-country reporting as something that is important. Obviously, it's important for tax justice. It's also something that is very material to investors in companies, given the scale of the tax evasion and avoidance that we have seen. In individual cases, some of these biggest companies in the U.S. are facing tax disputes to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. Microsoft, around 30 billion, not even including penalties and interest. And Coca-Cola also has a huge case, 16 billion and counting. And so those are huge numbers that are, even for these very large companies, are highly material for these companies and their investors. So in our view, this is something that is a material concern for investors. And we wrote a report a couple of years ago titled Material Concern that kind of outlines the case. And because it is so material to investors, it is something that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the top financial regulator here, has the authority. They already have under existing law, they have authority to issue regulations to require full public country-by-country reporting. So that's something we're continuing to push. And we recently filed a petition on behalf of a number of investors representing more than $2 trillion in assets under management, who made the case to the SEC that this is something that is material to them, and that the U.S. as a major capital markets jurisdiction should really be, leading and setting the standard, given the developments that we've seen in Australia recently and before that in Europe, although there's a lot of issues with the European reporting. So we are looking to the SEC to act on this.
I know that the Norwegian institutional investor KLP was in on that petition as well. So
they were the lead. They were our lead signatories. So yes, we were really pleased to have their support and grateful for their leadership.
We're happy to hear that. Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why we even wanted to have this episode today is you're touching on it here. Obviously the US is a very significant economy in itself, but there's also a lot of influence across the world that the US can have, and US companies have a lot of influence. So, but obviously we want to focus in today also on Trump and the incoming US administration and kind of how this will pan out in the tax transparency world. So maybe before we get into the real details, and we want to definitely hear like your prognosis as well for transparency issues that you're working on with FACT. But to start off, could you just say briefly, how was the field of tax and transparency? How did it move during the last Trump administration? And what are like the most significant kind of elements from this period that we might even look at for the next one?
That's a great question. I really love that question because if we kind of look at looking at the surface level, some of the rhetoric that we hear from Trump when he's running for office as a candidate is, of course, very discouraging on our set of issues. But I think it's really important to actually take a step back and look at what actually happened. So, actions and not words. And on that front, I think we can say it's a mixed bag, but it's not as negative as you might think. So earlier we spoke about the beneficial ownership registry. Well, that is something that that law was passed during the first Trump term and was signed into something that was even championed by the Trump's Treasury Department. So that's just an example of the kind of if you scratch the surface and look at what happened, it is a mixed bag. If we look at on the international tax policy side, it's we saw a major cut in the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21%. So that was not something that we supported. It was accompanied by a set of international tax reforms, which included actually some, I think, steps in the right direction. Imperfect and flawed, but step in the right direction. And here I'm thinking of, in particular, the global minimum tax that is called GILTI. You have to love the acronym, the creative congressional staffers that come up with the acronym. Global intangibles low taxed income. So companies that have been stashing their intellectual property in tax havens. Basically, this has been a long-standing problem, especially in American big tech and American pharma sectors, that we see companies, parking their IP in Ireland in particular, but also in other tax havens. So that law, as part of the 2017 Republican tax reform package, which on the whole was, a massive tax cut for the biggest corporations and for the wealthy, it included that one provision that actually is the genesis of this idea that there should be some floor on the amount of tax that big multinational corporations should pay. And I think it's quite a revolutionary idea that then, was picked up by the OECD, and we see Pillar 2 and all the debates around that. But actually, even on the OECD front, I should say that those negotiations started during the first Trump administration, and then were continued, and really the project grew under Secretary Yellen, and so now there are questions of what will happen there. But some of the ideas that motivated this actually came from the Republican tax reform package. So I think that's important to remember that it's not always all black and white, and I think we will have to see how it shakes out this time around. But at least last time we had some wins, so we are holding out hope for some wins this time around too.
Yeah, that's the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's the Republican tax package from 2017, right?
That's right. It was that's what it was named. Anytime politicians love to put the word jobs in to me, but I don't know that it actually created that many jobs. But that's what it's called.
Because I think something that's very different in the legislative process in Norway compared to a federal system as the US is that you have these large packages, like we have been covering quite extensively previously, the Build Back Better, which became the Inflation Reduction Act, which had so many different things, including like the attempt at Pillar 2, I think, or which they had to throw out. And so it's so interesting that we, and as far as I understood, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was promoted by Trump as this big tax cut, which it was, as you mentioned, cutting the tax rate for corporations from 35% to 21%. But in addition, it had this guilty provision, which is actually the inspiration for Pillar 2, as far as you mentioned, and as far as I've seen as well, which is, it's so strange that it came from the Trump administration, right?
Yeah. Another thing that I know happened during this period that is also related to the kind of US influence on the OECD was this proxy or close to kind of trade conflict with, for instance, France over digital service taxes. So how unilaterally countries can impose a certain level of tax on the revenues of big digital companies like Facebook, Google, that they were tired of them not paying taxes, where they actually had in like revenues, for example, in Europe. And a lot of these companies are based in the US. So when countries started to unilaterally impose these taxes, the US kind of got a bit frustrated. I think there was a tax on wine from France. No, a tariff.
Yeah, they tried a tariff on wine, but I think they stopped it because of US importers protesting or something.
Yeah. But basically that there was a strong reaction from the US because a lot of these companies that were impacted by these policies were based in the US. But that this also kind of pushed the US to engage further with the OECD and the discussions of the two-pillar solution. In some ways also, at least the Pillar 1 solution that's more related to a kind of distribution of taxing rights on the incomes of this type of big tech companies is included. So it's interesting to see the US's role and the US's willingness to kind of engage with international tax cooperation. It's very often based in kind of national interests. At least that's my impression. But yeah, I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
I think that's certainly true, especially if we're looking back on the first Trump term as president. And that's a really good point. I think that's something that's, if anything, it's likely to intensify this time around in terms of how transactional we can expect the administration to be. There's already all of this kind of really wild talk about trying to buy Greenland from Denmark and all of this kind of stuff. So I don't know if Norway has some parts that would be of strategic interest in the US, but
yeah, Svalbard.
We have the Arctic as well. Yeah. So let's hope Trump doesn't learn about Svalbard.
Yeah.
But no, I think that's right in terms of exactly how you explained it. That there was this desire from countries to make sure that these big American companies, again, mostly tech companies, are paying something when they were making these gigantic profits from consumers based in jurisdictions all over the world and not, hardly paying any taxes there. So I think it was a very valid motivation, and that U.S. response, in terms of retaliatory tariffs, is what prompted the idea that maybe we are better off with a multilateral solution like Pillar 1. And then, that's, in theory, that should be in everyone's interest to have more certainty and not to have these trade wars. So it's tricky, though, because Pillar 1 as a treaty would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and under the Constitution that requires 2/3. So it's a pretty tough road there, and of course, just kind of mathematically in the way that Pillar 1 is defined, to come into effect, it cannot come into effect unless the U.S. ratifies. So I think that is a challenge, and it's certainly one area that. We will be watching closely, and we're not the only ones. I know, for example, you mentioned France, but now Canada has introduced a digital service tax that's quite controversial here. So that's something to watch very closely in terms of how that unfolds, and not just the political response, but I think for me, I'm also interested in how the industry responds, because they have not been very vocal supporters of Pillar 1 so far, and it has become very kind of politicized here, the issue. But I think that compared to the alternative of having to face these digital service taxes and then, that potentially triggering a trade war with different countries, I think that is a far the Pillar 1 starts to look good as a preferable solution from the industry perspective. So we'll be watching to see how the industry responds and how their lobbyists, how they communicate on these issues.
Yeah.
Right. If we now we've sort of covered the previous Trump administration. If we now move ahead to what might be coming, I know that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we talked about is expiring at the end of 2025, and I remember reading a lot before the election last year about what might happen. They were calling it like a tax cliff and stuff because of the sort of how extreme the situation has to be in Congress for the two sides to negotiate. And there was a lot of speculation on what would happen given different electoral results. But I don't think, and obviously the Democrats may be pushing for implementing the Pillar 2 and sort of stopping the what they would see as the bad parts of the TCJA, but maybe the Republicans lobbying for even more tax cuts, for instance. But I don't think that many people expected, or maybe they did, but I haven't seen many analysis of what would have happened if the Trump or the Republicans won both houses in Congress, or both sides of Congress, as well as the presidency, which they have done. So
you're right. You caught us by surprise.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's good. What do you think will happen to maybe we can start specifically with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's set to expire, but do you think it will be continued or made less imposing on businesses, or what do you think will happen?
Yeah, so that's that question is kind of at the center of it's the talk of the town, or at least the tax nerds in Washington.
It's a small town.
What's going to happen? It is, as you put it, it's a tax cliff. It's also it's been called Taxmageddon, because if it doesn't get extended, then it's the end of the world as we know it. And the reason for that is because most of the tax cuts that were enacted in 2017 are set to expire, but not all of them. And that's interesting how that was kind of designed when the package was designed, that the parts of it that are more politically popular, so the individual tax cuts for individual taxpayers, that's the stuff that's expiring. Whereas the corporate tax, like we mentioned earlier, that the rate was cut from 35 to 21%, major tax cut for American corporations. That was made permanent. So that's not expiring. So because it's the very popular tax cuts that are expiring, there is a sense that the politicians will have to do something, that they have to extend the individual tax cuts. And in doing that, it kind of opens a whole fiscal can of worms, because the U.S. fiscal picture is not very, very pretty. We have a huge and growing budget deficit, and it's spiraling out of control. And there are some members of Congress, including some Republicans, who are very concerned about that. So because of that, they are looking for ways to kind of offset the extensions of the very popular individual tax cuts. And there are different ideas that have been suggested in how to do that. But it's not going to be easy, because the cost of, we're talking about trillions of dollars, so it's over 10 years, which is kind of the relevant budget window for the U.S. budget process. We look at the cost over 10 years, and it's almost close to $5 trillion just to extend, not even to introduce new tax cuts, but to extend the ones from 2017. And then on top of it, Trump has made a lot of different promises during the election campaign, which basically will double that figure, roughly speaking. We don't have exact numbers, because these were not like detailed policy plans. They were just kind of off-the-cuff things that he said in speeches about, that we shouldn't be taxing tips, we shouldn't be taxing this or that, So it all adds up to a few additional trillion. And if we, hold him to his word, and I'm not sure that we should, but it's a really difficult job for Congress to find a way to extend the tax cuts and do that in a fiscally responsible way. I think it's very, very difficult. But because of that, that's one of the reasons that I am not giving into pessimism. And I think that one of the potential ways to offset and to pay for individual tax cuts or for other priorities is to consider tightening the international tax reforms that we had in 2017, like GILTI. And there were other, in my mind, much more problematic, corporate giveaways that were included in 2017, which should be reconsidered. And if we kind of add all of that up, there's maybe it's a significant sum of money. Maybe if I had to ballpark, it could be around $1 trillion if Congress really takes a proper look at the international tax avoidance of the biggest American multinationals. And I think that's something that, politically resonates with voters, regardless of which party. Nobody wants to, support these big incredibly profitable corporations and to continue to subsidize them through our tax code. So I see some, some hope there, let's say, potentially.
Right, because that's very interesting because like the majority, the Republicans have a majority, but it's very narrow, right? And there are what do you call them, deficit hawks in Congress on the Republican side as well, who are worried, like you described, that the U.S. is getting into too much debt, and it sounds kind of similar to some extent as what happened with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Which became like vanned water out. Less ambitious, weakened. Due to mainly two senators, right, at the Democratic side, who are the most like centrist, essentially. Is it likely that they might, I'm thinking sort of two directions there. Is it likely that because of the deficit hawks, if I can call them that, they might find some way to, for instance, make the guilty into like a U.S. adaptation of Pillar 2? Or is it likely that they might go to the Democrats and sort of negotiate with them, which sounds kind of unlikely, at least the way we see the U.S. Congress from abroad? How do you think like the negotiations could work to sort of target the multinational companies better?
It's a really good question. It's also it's hard to say what will happen exactly, how this will unfold. But I think you are right. I completely agree that the margins, especially in the House, are so. It was just really a handful of members that gave Republicans the majority, and actually because Trump has been nominating House members for positions in the administration, so that means they will not be available to vote on because they will have other jobs. So the margin has actually shrunk to just one. So it's now they have majority of one extra vote. So they really cannot afford to lose anybody. So that means every Republican member of the House has kind of like veto power, if you will, over what the bill will look like. So I think that makes things incredibly difficult and challenging for the Republican leaders in Congress in terms of how they can get this done. And I wouldn't rule out that they might, as you said, try to work with some of the more centrist Democrats. The question is whether oftentimes these big bills, it will be a really huge package that will include maybe some things that you can agree with, but on the whole, if it's rolled together with other very controversial and partisan priorities like border security, which is a euphemism for the plan to deport millions of undocumented immigrants, or other non-tax issues, it might be difficult to get any Democrats on board with a package like that, even if there are some kind of tax-related sweeteners in there. So we're just in for a very interesting ride. I hesitate to make any predictions about what will happen, but we are we're going to be watching it very closely, and we already have some tax hearings coming up in Congress as soon as next week, so they're not wasting any time. And we'll see what happens. Yeah.
So connecting back with what we started this conversation about the more like transparency related issues, what way do you think we will see this administration go in terms of beneficial ownership, public CBCR? You already said there was some challenges coming from the courts, but do you think there's any? But then you also mentioned that a lot of these actually originated from the last Trump administration. Do you think there's any prospect for kind of advancement of the transparency agenda, or what's your prognosis?
Well, let me be clear-eyed here. I mean, I think that there are challenges for sure. On the beneficial ownership front, we have the litigation that is unfolding, and we are, in those cases, it is the government, so the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, that are defending the law. We and other external groups and experts are kind of helping them. We're on their side in these cases. But it is really, ultimately, it's up to them to put up a strong defense. And so far, they have been doing a great job. And I should also just clarify, because it's the negative rulings that get a lot of attention. But if we look at the total scoreboard, there is there are several of these cases that are pending, and in 3 of them so far, the government has won on the preliminary motions, and there were 2, one in Texas and one in Alabama, where the government lost. So if you kind of keep score 3-2, the government is winning. Yeah. And we are looking to the Treasury Department, Justice Department to continue that vigorous defense. This is, the norm. Usually, every administration defends the law that they're implementing. So there have been occasions when, over other kind of more controversial issues like the gay marriage ban in the Obama years, or the Muslim ban during the Trump administration, where there were issues where the government, where there was a change in government, and they might have disagreed, and they said, we're going to stop defending. We think that the beneficial ownership is a bipartisan idea that has bipartisan support, because in addition to kind of tax justice and anti-corruption implications and importance, it also is seen as a national security issue, because there's a terrorism finance angle. There are, Chinese fentanyl traffickers using shell companies and so on. So I think that it has a lot of bipartisan support, and we expect the next administration to continue to defend it, and we will work with them on that. So that's the beneficial ownership piece. On the tax transparency piece, I'm not as optimistic there, because just seeing the announcement for the SEC chair is someone who is.
What is the SEC? Could you just explain?
Sorry, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So Trump has nominated Paul Atkins, who has a record of kind of not his views on the need for enforcement of financial regulation is, he doesn't really believe that these regulations should be enforced. So just in general, that's not a person that is likely to be friendly to these issues of, the importance of tax transparency. So in all honesty, I don't know, for the next 4 years that we can expect much progress from, if we look at the SEC. That said, we will have new data coming out from the improved accounting standards that I mentioned earlier, and also the first reports from Europe and Australia will capture a lot of American companies. So that will be interesting to see, because I think it will show that this kind of reporting is possible. The sky's not going to fall down if you have to, disclose your tax information on a country by country basis. It's not going to make companies go bankrupt or make them so uncompetitive like some of the more objections have claimed. And so I think that will change the environment just because of these developments that will show that this is feasible, and also it will be interesting to see what it actually shows in terms of these companies, international tax operations and practices, and how that could inform the need for additional international tax reforms. Because if we see that the U.S. is often getting the short end of the stick when you look at some of these companies, and we got a glimpse of that, I should say, a few months ago when we saw tax reports from big American oil and gas companies. That it was not quite full public country-by-country reporting, but it was the payment to governments reporting that is for extractive companies. And I think you have this kind of law in Norway as well. So it was interesting to see this information for Exxon and Chevron, and to see how, they are paying more in taxes in UAE than they are in the US, even though they are American companies. And it's kind of, very unpatriotic of them, you could say. So anyway, but I think that kind of information will help to inform the tax policy debate and strengthen the calls for reform, because, these companies are homegrown companies. They benefit a lot from the US infrastructure and including the legal, and including in some cases subsidies and everything, and yet they manage to find ways to pay minimal taxes here. So I really putting a spotlight on that is going to change the debate significantly. And I think that would be true actually regardless of the election outcome, just to have the facts of what these companies are and aren't paying in taxes is the most important thing.
Yeah. And so obviously a lot of that can be addressed on a national level, which I see the US is doing to some extent. But again, there's also this dynamic of like international tax cooperation to kind of try to address the bigger picture. And we do know that Trump, at least vocally, isn't a very big supporter of multilateralism. I don't know if that's a understatement. But do you think there's any chance that the US, given this situation also with companies not really paying tax either in the US, do you think there's any chance that the Trump administration will kind of continue to engage with multilateral tax negotiations, both in the OECD, but there's also a lot of work accelerating in the UN, the work for a framework convention there? And even the G20, there's talk about, furthering coordination for a global wealth tax, or at least some more effective taxation of wealth. So do you see the US engaging in that under a Trump administration?
I wouldn't hold my breath on that. I mean, look, the US track record, especially under Trump, in terms of multilateralism, is not so great. One of the first things he did the last time around is to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Yeah. And so this is across the board, not just on tax. That said, I can see an incentive to try to stay at the negotiating table, especially with the OECD, because, the OECD pillars, as controversial as they are, it's a reality. They are implemented in many countries, not just in Europe, also in Asia, and even some, like Brazil, Nigeria are implementing. So this is just a fact of life for American multinational companies. They will have exposure to Pillar 2 if they have operations in countries that are implementing it. So I think that means that American tax policymakers have to grapple with that in terms of how they will respond. The policy baseline is changed from what it was in 2017 when they were negotiating the big tax cut package. And now I think that they have to really consider Pillar 2 and how it affects American multinationals. So for that reason, I would expect continued engagement with the OECD, even if it, I can't say how constructive that engagement would be, but similarly on the UN front, the US has been one of the so-called blocker countries. Although I will just note, I think in my mind it's not quite an accurate term, because it's not like they have managed to block anything. Unlike in the Security Council, the U.S. doesn't have a veto. So the process is still unfolding with or without the U.S. And it's just, I think, unfortunately, it's not a good look that the U.S., even under the Biden administration, decided to vote no rather than at least abstain, as some European countries have done. And I don't know where Norway stands.
Norway abstained as well. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So the U.S. has been voting no, and but continuing to engage with the process. So I would expect that kind of stance to continue even with the change in administration.
Yeah.
All right. Do you? Maybe a utopian dream, but something we've kind of been imagining is that we already discussed the sort of almost proxy trade war after the DST implementations, but the result, as you mentioned, is that the US actually came to the negotiating table in the OECD to make the rules better for US companies. Instead of having all these different DSTs, they could have the Pillar 1, right? And a bit of maybe a dream we have and a hope is that we could maybe do that with country-by-country reporting, because there are so many different ones. Like you mentioned, the extractives, Pillar 2 has one, Australia is getting one, the EU has one, we're trying to make another one in Norway, banking in Europe has one, So if more countries push for this unilaterally, could we replicate the DST stuff and get the US to, maybe in the OECD, I guess, push for a multilateral solution to make to sort of harmonize all these rules so that it's not that complicated for businesses?
I love your utopian dream. It's beautiful. And I think, look, I agree with your assessment. There's a proliferation of different standards, and that's not helpful for anybody, really. For companies that have to, it increases their compliance costs to have to do one thing for the OECD, another thing for the EU, a third thing for Australia, and so on. And for the users of this information, as someone who looks at these reports, you kind of have to think about, well, what is the list of jurisdictions in the EU? What is it in Australia? So they're not perfectly comparable for purposes of analysis. So there are issues. And it would be great if there could be one global standard. I think that would be ideal. That said, I don't know if OECD is the place for that, because, when the OECD considered these issues, they landed on a confidential filing. Yeah. So they have, the CBCR that reports that are collected under the OECD standard are just shared confidentially among governments, and only certain governments. Not every government has access to them, which is a big issue especially for developing countries that are, that don't kind of meet that bar. So they're shut out of that system. And but I think it could be interesting to consider whether the OECD could revisit that, and especially given the pressure that they are under from the UN process and the Global South countries, raising concerns about not having enough, not being well represented and included in the OECD decision making. I think this could be one way that the OECD could demonstrate that they hear those concerns and that they respond to them, and to really kind of improve the confidential CBCR system that they have, and to make it fully public. That would be amazing.
Yeah. So I think it's been a really great conversation, and I think we covered a lot, maybe more than we even thought we would. Yeah. But I just want to kind of end on a slightly different note. But we've mentioned a couple of times different cabinet appointments, and in general, there's this sense, at least from Norway, that there's a risk of some of these appointments being perhaps more personal or politically motivated to some extent, rather than, necessarily the people most fit to do the job. I don't know if that's a very harsh way of putting it, but do you see that there's kind of a risk within the new Trump administration of the to the U.S. democracy to some extent, with new types of appointments? And we already know that the Supreme Court has been to some extent politicized the last years, which has had a huge impact on also big cases. Let's say abortion being maybe the most prominent one lately. So, do you want to end this kind of talk with some kind of reflections on this topic? Is it something that touches on your work?
Okay, let me try to. I was hoping that we could end on a positive note, but I'll take your question.
So sorry, we can never.
Look, the people who have been nominated so far, for the most part, are incredibly wealthy and/or incredibly loyal to Trump, and that's, in a way, that's no different than last time around. We have a cabinet of billionaires that is not going to look very representative of regular Americans, and especially the high-profile role and influence that Elon Musk has had since the election has been surprising and troubling to see. But if I kind of stick to my tax box, I think I mean it's hard to say on the Treasury Secretary. We don't have that much information to really form a judgment. Actually, his confirmation hearing was just scheduled for next week. So, I can tell you more in a week from today what his tax views are and how that looks. The person that was nominated for the IRS is for me very troubling, because he doesn't have any kind of relevant qualification or experience, other than the fact that he has promoted very aggressively this tax credit that has been that there's been a lot of fraud that relating to that tax credit, and it's been named, that has been named as one of the top tax scams. And so to have someone like that in charge of the tax agency is really, that's discouraging and worrying. And we'll have to keep our eyes wide open to kind of see how these different nominees, will they all pass the confirmation? I think everyone is assuming, because Republicans do have majority in the Senate, but still they have to go through confirmation hearings, and there will be some interesting and maybe uncomfortable facts that will come up in those hearings. So we will see. I think part of this is also, besides pushing for our tax transparency reforms and tax justice reforms, is also kind of accountability role that we have to play, and really kind of keep our eyes wide open and follow how this is going, and that's all we can do.
We're very happy that at least Fact Coalition and your member organizations do exist, and that the civil society space in the US keeps being, active. And wish you all the luck with this work. Yeah, and thanks so much for the conversation we just had. It was really, really interesting and very eye-opening, I think, and not that negative maybe as I was, or pessimistic as I was expecting or fearing.
Thank you very much. It was really fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.